The call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing feels important until suddenly everything is. A lawyer I'd never met said my name carefully, like it carried weight now. Then he told me I had inherited 1,500 acres of lakefront ranch land. I laughed at first. I thought it was a mistake. People like me don't just inherit massive lake ranches. But the documents were real. The land was real. And so was the problem that came with it. The property sat miles outside town, wrapped around a deep blue lake that looked untouched, almost frozen in time. Old fences, rolling grass, trees that had probably stood there longer than anyone alive. It was the kind of place people dream about owning but never do. I drove out there expecting peace, maybe closure. What I found instead made my stomach drop. Right near the water, where the land curved perfectly around the lake, stood a massive mansion. Glass walls, stone columns, a private dock stretching into the water like it owned the view. It didn't belong there, and according to every document in my hand, it didn't belong to the person living inside it either. That's when I met her. She walked out like she was expecting me. Perfect posture, perfect smile, the kind of confidence that doesn't ask questions because it's never been told no. She introduced herself as part of the HOA, spoke fast, and talked down to me like I was trespassing on my own land. She said the mansion was approved, said the HOA had jurisdiction, said I should probably leave before I embarrassed myself further. I didn't argue, not yet. I just listened, because standing behind her confidence was something else. Fear, maybe, or the assumption that power always protects itself. She talked about community rules, lakefront regulations, and how people like me didn't understand how things worked around here. The HOA, she said, had already settled everything. Permits, boundaries, ownership, end of story. But something didn't add up. The land records told a different version. The inheritance paperwork was clear. The lake, the shoreline, the exact coordinates, all mine. Yet here was a luxury mansion built squarely on that land, backed by an HOA that acted like the truth was negotiable. As I drove away that evening, the sun dropping low over the water, one question kept repeating in my head. Was this a mistake buried in paperwork? Or was someone betting I'd never push back? Because somewhere between the quiet lake, the smiling HOA president, and the mansion that shouldn't exist, there was a lie. And I was about to find out how far it went. What I didn't know then was that a single, forgotten survey map, one piece of paper no one thought mattered anymore, was already waiting to tear everything apart. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mansion reflected in the lake, like it was daring me to challenge it. By morning, the excitement of the inheritance had faded, replaced by something heavier: responsibility, risk, and the quiet realization that land like this doesn't come without history. The ranch had belonged to a distant relative I barely knew, a man who kept to himself. No kids, no close friends in town. People described him as private, which I was learning was another word for out of the way. He bought the land decades ago, before lakefront property became a luxury keyword real estate agents loved to throw around, before HOAs, before private docks and gated communities, back when ownership meant fences, surveys, and silence. The more I read through the old documents, the clearer it became. The boundaries were precise. The lake wasn't shared. The shoreline wasn't communal. This wasn't HOA land that grew by accident. This was a lake ranch with a paper trail older than the town's welcome sign. That's what made the mansion feel so personal. Like someone had walked into a locked house and rearranged the furniture, assuming the owner would never return. I went back the next day, this time during peak daylight. The property looked even more unreal under the sun. Birds skimmed the water. The wind moved through the trees like nothing was wrong. But the closer I got to the mansion, the more the air changed. Security cameras, fresh gravel, signs about private community access. Each one felt like a line drawn across something that wasn't theirs to claim. She was waiting again. This time, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She spoke slower, choosing words carefully, like someone used to meetings and minutes and official language. She mentioned the HOA bylaws. mentioned how the community had invested heavily in maintaining the lake. She implied that my inheritance was outdated, that records change, that progress has a way of correcting old mistakes. Mistakes? I asked her one simple question. Can I see the original survey? Her expression flickered, just for a second. Then she laughed it off, said surveys were handled by professionals, said I wouldn't understand the technical side. She reminded me that fighting an HOA could get expensive, draining, lonely. That was the first time I felt it clearly, the pressure, not loud, not aggressive, just steady, psychological, like the expectation was that I'd get tired and walk away. People in town started recognizing my truck. Conversations stopped when I entered diners. A man at the gas station warned me quietly that the HOA had deep pockets. Another told me I was messing with lake people, whatever that meant. At night, I walked the edge of the water on my land. The dock from the mansion cut across the lake like a claim marker. I imagined how long it took to build, how many approvals had been signed, how many people had nodded along, knowing or choosing not to know where the boundaries really were. And the question kept growing heavier. Was this a misunderstanding that snowballed out of control? Or was it deliberate? Had someone seen an old owner, no heirs, and assumed the land was free for the taking? The paperwork sat on my kitchen table, spread out like a quiet accusation. Deeds, maps, dates, everything pointed one way, yet the reality on the ground pointed another. Somewhere between those two versions of truth, a line had been crossed, and I was starting to realize that uncovering it wouldn't just cost time or money. It would force people to admit things they'd spent years pretending not to see. The next letter arrived by certified mail, thick and heavy, the kind that feels expensive before you even open it. The return address belonged to a law firm in the city, the name printed in raised ink. Inside was a warning dressed up as courtesy. They represented the Homeowners Association. They acknowledged my recent interest in the lake ranch and advised me to respect established community boundaries while the matter was clarified. It didn't say cease and desist. It didn't have to. The message was clear. Stop looking too closely. I folded the letter and set it aside, but the words stayed with me. Clarified by whom? And since when did inheritance require permission? That question followed me into town, where the subplots began to surface. A waitress lingered a little too long at my table and quietly told me she used to clean houses near the lake. She'd seen the mansion go up fast. Too fast. Crews working late. Deliveries after dark. She said people asked questions at first, then stopped. Jobs disappeared. Contracts got reassigned. The lake had a way of rewarding silence. Another thread appeared through the surveyor I tried to hire. The first one declined, claiming a scheduling issue. The second never called back. The third finally met me but refused to step foot near the mansion. He said, almost apologetically, that he'd worked for the HOA before. Said boundaries could get complicated when powerful people were involved. When I asked if he'd ever seen the original survey, he looked past me and said nothing. I started questioning my own resolve. Not the facts, but the cost. I wasn't a wealthy land baron. I was someone who inherited a problem disguised as a dream. Part of me wondered if the easier choice was to sell. Walk away. Let the lake keep its secrets. That thought scared me more than the legal threats because it sounded like exactly what they were counting on. Meanwhile, she changed tactics. Her confidence turned public. HOA meetings suddenly included my name. I was labeled uncooperative, uninformed, someone who didn't understand lakefront regulations or community standards. They painted me as the outsider trying to disrupt harmony. I watched recordings online, her calm voice framing the story before I ever got to speak. Control the narrative, control the outcome. The moral line blurred in small ways. Neighbors who waved politely but wouldn't meet my eyes. A local contractor who backed out of a fence repair, citing pressure. Even friends started asking if I was sure the fight was worth it. They meant well. That almost made it worse. Late one afternoon, I drove to the far edge of the property, where an old shed leaned under the weight of time. Inside, among rusted tools and dust-covered shelves, I found a box of documents my relative had kept. Old correspondence, handwritten notes, and references to a survey update that was never filed publicly. Not missing, just misplaced. That detail lingered. Why update a survey and not record it? Why keep it private? At the same time, another complication surfaced. A developer's sign appeared near the lake road, advertising future, luxury community expansion. That's when it clicked. The mansion wasn't the end goal. It was proof of concept. If she could build there without challenge, everything else would follow. Standing at the water's edge that night, I felt the weight of the choice ahead. Fight and become the problem they warned everyone about. Or walk away and become the reason they were right. What I didn't see yet was how close the truth already was. Or how many people were quietly hoping I'd never find it. By the time the official notice arrived, there was no pretending this was just paperwork anymore. The envelope was thin, no letterhead, just a stamped warning that a formal boundary review would take place at the lake in 72 hours. No invitation, no schedule I'd agreed to, just a date, a time, and a quiet assumption that the outcome was already decided. I drove out to the ranch that evening, fast. The sky was low and gray, the lake darker than I'd ever seen it. Wind cut across the water in sharp lines. Even the birds were gone. The mansion lights were on. I parked near the old fence line and walked the shoreline, step by step, counting, matching landmarks to the notes I'd found in the shed. The oak tree split at the trunk, the bend in the water, the rock shelf just beneath the surface. Everything lined up, too perfectly. That's when I saw it. A wooden stake, half buried near the waterline, weathered, old, almost erased by time. I knelt, brushing dirt away with my hands. Faded markings, survey notation, the kind no one used anymore. My chest tightened. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was physical proof. Right here, right where her dock cut into the lake. Footsteps crunched behind me. I stood slowly. She didn't smile this time. Her voice was calm, controlled, but thinner than before. She asked what I thought I was doing on their side of the lake. I told her I was walking my land. She said that would be decided soon enough. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. You don't want to make enemies over a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. The word hung between us, heavy. I realized then she knew more than she'd ever admitted. Enough to be afraid. Enough to threaten without raising her voice. The next day, the pressure doubled. A call from the law firm. Polite. Firm. They warned me that obstructing an HOA-sanctioned survey could have consequences. Financial ones. I asked who hired the surveyor. Silence. Then a deflection. All parties have been considered. They hadn't. That night, I laid everything out on the table. Old maps. New deeds. Notes from the shed. The stake location marked in red. One document stood out, a reference to a final verification survey completed years ago, signed, sealed, and never submitted. It wasn't missing. It was withheld. On purpose. Someone had known the truth long before the mansion was built. The morning of the review arrived too quickly. Trucks lined the lake road. Clipboards. Measuring equipment. HOA board members standing in a tight group. She stood at the center, composed, dressed like this was a victory lap. I walked down to the water, my hands steady even though my pulse wasn't. The surveyor began setting up, calling out measurements that didn't match what I knew. Not even close. I stepped forward. I said one sentence. Quiet. Clear. That line is wrong. Heads turned. The lake went silent. The surveyor hesitated, eyes flicking toward her. She gave a small shake of her head. Almost invisible. I reached into my jacket. My fingers closed around the folded paper I hadn't shown anyone yet. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. This wasn't just about land. It was about who got to decide the truth. And I was seconds away from forcing the issue. The paper felt thinner than it should have. That was the first thing that hit me as I unfolded it. I'd built this moment up in my head. Imagined the weight of proof. The satisfaction of finally watching the story crack open. But as my eyes scanned the page, my stomach dropped. It wasn't the survey I thought it was. It looked official. Signed. Stamped. Clean. Too clean. The boundary lines had been adjusted. Subtly. Just enough to place the mansion and dock safely inside HOA-controlled land. Anyone glancing at it would assume it was legitimate. Final. Settled. The surveyor exhaled, relieved, and nodded like the tension had already passed. She didn't look at me. Not yet. Instead, she addressed the group. Calm. Measured. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke about confusion being resolved, and emphasized community stability. The HOA board members relaxed. One even smiled. That's when the second twist landed. I recognized the signature. Not hers. Not the surveyor's. My relatives. The man who owned the land before me. The realization hit like cold water. The document wasn't forged. It was altered with permission. Or at least with a signature that said permission had been given. My chest tightened as the implication settled in. Had he sold part of the land quietly? Had he cut a deal I never knew about? Across the clearing, she finally met my eyes. There it was. The confidence again. Not arrogance this time. Certainty. She'd planned for this moment. The law firm rep stepped forward and spoke directly to me. Voice low, almost sympathetic. He explained that years ago, a boundary adjustment had been negotiated to support community development. He said the owner at the time had been compensated generously. Confidentially. Perfectly legal. I wanted to argue, to shout, but doubt crept in fast. I hadn't known my relative well. I didn't know what he'd done or why, and that uncertainty was exactly what they were using. While the group focused on the paperwork, I noticed something else. The surveyor wasn't measuring anymore. He was watching her. Waiting. She nodded once. He packed up his equipment. The review was ending. That's when betrayal surfaced from the last place I expected. A man stepped out from behind one of the trucks. Older. Quiet. I recognized him from town. The one who'd warned me early on. He didn't look at the HOA board. He looked at me, and he shook his head. Slowly. No, he said. Louder than he probably meant to. That's not the final version. Everything stopped. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, worn at the edges. He explained that he'd worked for the county years ago, that he'd archived surveys before the system went digital, that one file had been flagged but never uploaded. He kept a copy because it didn't make sense at the time. Cross-cutting reactions rippled through the crowd. The HOA lawyer stiffened. The surveyor stepped back. She didn't move at all. The man handed me the envelope. Inside was the missing verification survey. The real one. Same signature. Same date. But the boundary lines were different. Drastically different. The mansion sat dead center on my land. Her breath caught. Just once. The law firm rep demanded a pause. Called for a recess. Suddenly, the confidence evaporated, replaced by urgency and quiet chaos. Phones came out. People moved away in tight clusters. Decisions were being made in real time. She leaned toward me, voice sharp now, controlled slipping. You don't know what you're doing, she said. This doesn't end the way you think. She was right about one thing. It didn't end there. Because standing by the lake, holding two versions of the truth, I realized this wasn't just about exposing a lie. It was about deciding what to do with it. And whatever choice I made next was going to cost someone everything. The lake felt impossibly still as everything slowed down around me. Two surveys. Same signature. Same date. Two different truths. The crowd waited, not breathing, like the land itself was holding its breath too. The county official arrived just before noon. No sirens. No announcement. Just a quiet authority that cut through the tension like a blade. He asked for the documents. All of them. The altered survey. The archived verification. The inheritance deed. He spread them across the hood of his vehicle. Studied the lines, the ink, the margins. He didn't rush. That patience felt louder than shouting. She stood a few steps back now. Not centered anymore. No speeches. No confident explanations. Just stillness. I noticed her hands for the first time. They were shaking. The official finally spoke. He pointed to the older verification survey, the one pulled from the archive. He explained that it had been completed to correct an earlier clerical error, not to change ownership. It had never been filed because the landowner at the time had withdrawn the submission. Not to sell, not to negotiate, to stop development. That's when the unexpected detail surfaced. Attached to the survey was a handwritten note from my relative. Short, direct, almost blunt. It said he'd been approached by the HOA years ago, pressured to adjust the boundary for the good of the community. Offered money, offered peace. He'd signed an initial version under pressure, then realized what it would enable. So he commissioned the correction. And when he understood how hard they were pushing, he pulled it from public record and locked it away. He'd been protecting the land. The silence broke in layers. Confusion, whispers, anger. The HOA lawyer tried to argue procedural timelines, but the official cut him off. The altered survey, he said, couldn't override a verified correction tied to the original deed, especially one tied to an inheritance. The boundary was mine. The dock, the mansion, every stone and glass panel built past that line. Hers. She stepped forward then, voice raised for the first time. She said it wasn't fair, that the community had invested, that people lived there now, that mistakes had been made but they couldn't be undone without consequences. I looked past her at the lake, at the dock slicing into water that had never belonged to anyone but the land itself. And I realized something else my relative had understood. Power only feels permanent until it's questioned. The county official issued a temporary injunction. Construction halted. HOA authority suspended over the disputed area. Formal proceedings scheduled. The crowd slowly dispersed, some angry, some relieved, some stunned. She didn't leave right away. As the last trucks pulled away, she stood alone near the mansion, staring at the water like it had betrayed her. When she finally turned to me, the confidence was gone. All that remained was calculation. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "Maybe." But as she walked back toward the house, I felt something settle. Not victory, not revenge, just truth finally standing in the open. That evening, I walked the shoreline again. Same landmarks, same oak tree, same rock shelf beneath the water. The stake I'd found earlier stood where it always had, waiting to be noticed. The final twist came days later, buried in paperwork. The mansion wasn't just built illegally. It was insured, financed, and approved based on the altered survey alone, which meant everything tied to it, loans, permits, authority, rested on a lie. The fantasy didn't just end, collapsed. And standing there, with the lake reflecting the sky like it always had, I understood why my relative never fought publicly. He'd known the land didn't need defending forever. It just needed someone willing to finish the story. In the weeks that followed, the lake grew quiet again. Not the tense quiet it had held during the fight, but a deeper, steadier calm, like something heavy had finally been set down. The legal process moved forward slowly, the way truth often does when it's been buried for too long. The HOA's authority over the disputed land was officially revoked. Permits tied to the mansion were frozen. The luxury development sign by the road disappeared overnight. People in town started talking differently. Some apologized. Some avoided the subject entirely. A few admitted they'd always known something wasn't right but didn't think it was their place to say anything. I understood that now. Silence is easier when power looks permanent. The woman who once spoke for everyone stopped attending HOA meetings. I heard the mansion would likely be sold to cover legal costs. The dock was ordered removed. What had been built as a symbol of control slowly turned into a reminder of overreach. I didn't celebrate that. I just watched it happen, the way you watch a storm pass once it's already spent its force. As for me, the ranch stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like a responsibility I could finally carry. I learned more about the land than I ever expected to know. Where the water deepened suddenly, which trees held their leaves longest, how the shoreline changed with the seasons. I began restoring the old fence lines, not to keep people out, but to honor where the land had always drawn its own boundaries. The subplots tied themselves together quietly. The county worker who stepped forward returned to his life, his part finished. The surveyor who once refused to measure called to apologize. Even some HOA members reached out, admitting they trusted paperwork more than truth. I didn't hold on to anger. I didn't need to anymore. The biggest answer came from my relative, long after he was gone. His notes filled in the gaps I hadn't understood at first. He hadn't been trying to avoid conflict. He'd been buying time, waiting for someone who would care enough to ask the right questions. Someone who wouldn't sell the land just because it was easier. Standing at the lake one evening, watching the sun fall into the water, I realized the inheritance was never just acreage or value. It was a choice, to protect something when no one is watching, to push back when the truth is inconvenient, to remember that ownership isn't about control, it's about stewardship. The mansion will likely be gone someday. The lake won't notice. It was here long before any of us showed up with surveys and signatures. Long after the arguments fade, it will keep reflecting the sky the same way it always has. There's a lesson in that. Power built on shortcuts doesn't last. Silence doesn't equal consent. And the truth, even when folded and hidden away, has a way of finding daylight. If the story made you think, or reminded you of a moment when you had to choose between the easy path and the right one, take that with you. Share it. Talk about it. Ask questions where they're not encouraged. Because sometimes, all it takes to end a fantasy is one person willing to unfold the paper and look closely. And if there's one thing this land taught me, it's this. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs someone brave enough to stand where the line really is. ***.